Halfway around the world in two completely different hemispheres, millions of people are experiencing some of the most extreme temperatures their regions have ever recorded. It's not a coincidence. It's not a fluke. And it's definitely not something we can ignore anymore. Welcome to a world where heat records are no longer occasional anomalies. They're becoming the new normal. This week, we're diving deep into a story that's unfolding right now on two continents simultaneously, and what scientists are saying should alarm us all. Let's start with what's happening. In the span of just 7 days, two continents, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, have experienced extraordinary temperature surges that would have been virtually impossible to predict just a few decades ago. On one side of the world, parts of North Africa and the Middle East are sweltering under temperatures that have shattered previous records. We're talking about heat so intense that asphalt is literally softening. Power grids are straining under the demand for air conditioning, and people are being advised to stay indoors during the peak hours of the day. Meanwhile, on another continent, Southern Europe is experiencing something equally unprecedented. Cities that have enjoyed moderate Mediterranean climates for centuries are now facing heat waves that are pushing temperatures to levels that were considered impossible just years ago. This isn't just a story about summer heat. This is a story about the planet fundamentally changing in real time. The convergence of these two heat events in the same week is what's capturing the attention of climate scientists worldwide. Dr. Margaret Chen, a leading atmospheric researcher at the Global Climate Institute, described this phenomenon as a critical indicator of systemic change in our planet's climate patterns. What makes this moment particularly significant is the timing. Both events are occurring during their respective summer seasons, yes, but the intensity and the geographic spread are what's raising red flags among experts. When two regions on opposite sides of the globe experience record-breaking heat simultaneously, it suggests that the underlying causes aren't local, they're global. Let's focus on what's happening across North Africa and the Middle East, because the numbers here are genuinely staggering. In countries like Libya, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, temperatures have climbed to levels that are breaking records that stood for decades. We're talking about readings that often exceed 50 degrees Celsius, that's 122 degrees Fahrenheit, and in some cases, pushing close to 55 degrees Celsius, or about 131 degrees Fahrenheit. To understand what that means, let's put it in perspective. At 50 degrees Celsius, the human body cannot cool itself through perspiration alone. Exposure to these temperatures for extended periods becomes life-threatening within hours. This isn't theoretical. People are actually experiencing this right now. In Cairo, Egypt, temperatures have soared to levels not seen in recorded history. The capital city, home to over 20 million people, has been essentially brought to a standstill during peak heat hours. Schools have closed. Outdoor work has been halted. Public transportation systems have been curtailed because even the infrastructure itself cannot function safely at these temperatures. What's particularly concerning is how these heat waves are affecting vulnerable populations. In crowded urban slums and rural areas where access to air conditioning is limited or non-existent, people are literally fighting for survival. Emergency rooms are overflowing with heat-related illnesses. Dehydration, heat stroke, and heat exhaustion have become the leading causes of hospital admissions in multiple countries across the region. The economic impact is equally severe. Agriculture, which is the lifeblood of many of these nations, is being devastated. Crops are withering in the fields. Livestock is dying from heat stress. Water supplies, already stressed in this arid region, are becoming critically low as reservoirs evaporate at unprecedented rates. Power generation is also at the brink of crisis. The massive demand for air conditioning to keep people alive is pushing electrical grids to their absolute limits. Rolling blackouts are becoming common, which creates a vicious cycle. Without air conditioning, people cannot escape the deadly heat, but the power grid cannot handle the load when everyone tries to run their air conditioners simultaneously. In the Persian Gulf region, the situation is particularly acute. Countries like the United Arab Emirates and Qatar have invested heavily in air conditioning infrastructure, but even their sophisticated systems are being tested like never before. The cooling systems in office buildings, shopping centers, and residential complexes are running at maximum capacity continuously, putting enormous strain on both the equipment and the power supply. One particularly telling sign of how extreme conditions have become is the visible heat shimmer that now appears on streets and highways even during early morning hours. Drivers are reporting that their vehicles are overheating despite modern cooling systems. Tire blowouts are becoming more common because the asphalt itself is becoming too hot, causing tires to fail. Meteorologists monitoring the situation report that the heat dome, a pattern of high atmospheric pressure that traps warm air and prevents it from moving, is remarkably stubborn. Instead of the typical day or two that these patterns usually last, this one has persisted for weeks, with no significant relief forecast in the coming months. The psychosocial impact on residents cannot be overlooked either. People are experiencing anxiety and stress from simply knowing that stepping outside could be life-threatening. Mental health services are reporting increased calls from individuals struggling with heat-related anxiety and climate-related distress. Now, let's turn our attention across the Mediterranean to southern Europe, where a remarkably similar story is unfolding, but with its own unique characteristics and challenges. Countries including Spain, Italy, Greece, and Portugal are currently experiencing what many local meteorologists are calling the most severe heat wave in at least 50 years. In some areas, it's the worst heat event in recorded history for that particular location. In Spain, temperatures have reached 45 degrees Celsius in major cities, and in some rural areas, readings have pushed beyond 47 degrees. To put this in context, Barcelona, a city known for its Mediterranean climate, experienced temperatures that were 10 to 15 degrees above normal. That might sound like a modest increase, but the compounding effects of sustained high heat are catastrophic. Greece has been particularly hard hit. The ancient country, home to some of the world's most historically significant landmarks, has been battling not just the heat itself, but massive wildfires that have been turbocharged by the extreme conditions. The Acropolis in Athens, that iconic symbol of Western civilization, has been surrounded by warnings about heat exposure. Tourists have been collapsing from heat exhaustion while visiting historical sites. Italy's experience has been equally alarming. In Rome, temperatures have consistently exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, with heat index values making conditions feel even more extreme. The Vatican has issued guidance to pilgrims about the dangers of being outdoors during peak hours. Portugal, on the western edge of Europe, has seen some of its highest temperatures on record. The country, which is more accustomed to moderate heat, has found itself completely unprepared for the intensity of this heat wave. Healthcare systems have been strained as heat-related illnesses surge. What makes the European situation unique is how it's affecting infrastructure and systems that were never designed to handle this level of heat. European cities and towns were built for a climate that was significantly cooler than what they're now experiencing. Public transportation systems are struggling. Trains have been delayed or canceled because the overhead wires and tracks expand and become unstable at these temperatures. Bus routes have been modified or eliminated because drivers cannot safely operate vehicles and riders cannot safely wait at stations. The underground metro systems, which are usually cooler refugees from street-level heat, are becoming dangerously warm as the constant flow of people generates body heat in enclosed spaces. Power systems are also being severely tested. The demand for air conditioning and cooling has sent electricity demand soaring. Rolling blackouts, while less common in developed European nations than in less developed regions, have occurred in some areas. More concerning is the strain on the power plants themselves. Many use water for cooling, and with water temperatures rising and water availability declining, some plants have had to reduce output or shut down temporarily. There's also a profound psychological and social dimension to this crisis in Europe. Europeans are not accustomed to this level of heat. The region's cities and communities were designed for cooler climates. Streets lack sufficient shade. Public buildings often don't have adequate cooling systems. People simply aren't accustomed to taking heat as seriously as it demands. Hospitals across southern Europe have reported surging admissions for heat-related illnesses, particularly among the elderly population. Those living in older apartment buildings with no air conditioning have been especially vulnerable. Some nations have instituted cool centers, public spaces with air conditioning where people can go to escape the heat, but the demand far exceeds capacity in many cases. The agricultural sector in Europe has also been severely impacted. Vineyards in France and Italy, which produce some of the world's most prized wines, are experiencing crop stress. Olive groves across the Mediterranean region are suffering. Early harvest has been necessary in some areas, with concerns about how the quality and yield of crops will be affected. Wildlife and ecosystems are also showing severe stress. Birds have been falling from the sky, literally unable to cope with the heat. Aquatic ecosystems are being disrupted as water temperatures rise, affecting fish populations and plant life. Forests are at extreme fire risk, and indeed, massive wildfires have been ravaging multiple countries. So the natural question everyone is asking is, why is this happening? Why are two continents experiencing record heat at the same time? The answers that climate scientists are providing paint a troubling picture of our planet's future. First, let's talk about climate change broadly. The planet's average temperature has risen approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. That might sound small, but it represents an enormous shift in global energy balance. Every fraction of a degree of warming means that heat waves are not just hotter, they're also longer lasting and more frequent. Climate models have predicted this for years. Scientists have been saying that as the planet warms, we'll see more frequent and more intense heat waves. What's happening now is consistent with those predictions. But here's what's particularly important. The models predicted this would happen eventually, and now it's not eventual, it's now. The specific mechanism driving these simultaneous events involves several atmospheric patterns. One key factor is the position and behavior of the jet stream. the fast-flowing river of air high in the atmosphere that typically guides weather systems from west to east across the northern hemisphere. When the jet stream becomes more wavy or amplified, it can create what meteorologists call blocking patterns. These are situations where high-pressure systems essentially park themselves over a region and stay there, preventing normal weather patterns from moving through. The result is that once hot air gets trapped under one of these blocks, it stays put and temperatures keep climbing. Right now, there appear to be multiple blocking patterns affecting both regions simultaneously, which is why we're seeing this convergence of heat events. One research team at the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts suggested that these patterns are themselves becoming more stable and persistent. They're not moving as quickly as they used to. Another crucial factor is the warming of the Mediterranean Sea and other bodies of water. Warmer ocean water provides more moisture for the atmosphere and creates conditions that fuel even more intense heat and potentially severe weather. The Mediterranean has been warming at a rate faster than the global average, creating what scientists call a heat reservoir that amplifies heat waves. There's also the urban heat island effect to consider, particularly for the major cities experiencing extreme temperatures. Urban areas, with their dark asphalt, concrete, and reduced vegetation, absorb and radiate significantly more heat than surrounding rural areas. As cities have grown and sprawled, this effect has become more pronounced. In a normal year, this might mean cities are a few degrees hotter than the countryside. But when you combine the urban heat island effect with a continent-wide heat wave, the result can be extreme conditions that are truly dangerous. Additionally, climate scientists are pointing to the potential role of reduced snow and ice coverage. As Arctic ice continues to decline, the polar regions absorb more heat because water absorbs more solar radiation than ice, which can alter the temperature gradient between the poles and the equator. This in turn can affect the behavior of the jet stream and the development of weather systems. Some researchers suggest that a warming Arctic paradoxically contributes to more extreme heat waves in mid-latitudes. Deforestation and land use changes also play a role. Where forests have been cleared for agriculture or development, the land is hotter and drier. It reflects less moisture into the atmosphere, which can make heat waves even more intense. In both Africa and Europe, deforestation has been occurring, and this may be contributing to the severity of current conditions. Dr. James Richardson, a climate scientist at Oxford University, explained it this way. What we're seeing is not just a simple warming of the planet. We're seeing the emergence of new patterns and behaviors in our climate system that are particularly concerning, because they're not behaviors we've seen before, or at least not at this frequency and intensity. The timing of these events, happening simultaneously on two continents, is also significant because it demonstrates how interconnected our climate system has become. Changes in one region affect conditions worldwide through atmospheric circulation patterns, ocean currents, and other interconnected systems. Given the severity of what's happening, the scientific community is intensely focused on several key metrics and indicators that will tell us what happens next. First, scientists are watching for any signs of expansion of these heat zones. If the blocking patterns that are causing this heat continue to migrate or intensify, we could see heat reaching further northward into Europe, or affecting other regions around the Mediterranean and Middle East. Extended models are being scrutinized for any indication that this heat might persist into the fall months, which would be highly unusual. Second, researchers are carefully monitoring the impact on the jet stream itself. Some climate models suggest that under continued global warming, the jet stream may become increasingly prone to these kinds of large amplitude waves and blocking patterns. If that's true, we could be looking at a future where these kinds of simultaneous multi-continental heat events become routine rather than extraordinary. That possibility is deeply concerning to the scientific community. Third, scientists are watching the oceans. Sea surface temperatures are being monitored with particular intensity because they're a critical driver of atmospheric conditions. The Mediterranean is currently experiencing what's being called a marine heat wave, water temperatures significantly above normal. Such marine heat waves have profound impacts on ecosystems and can also influence the intensity and duration of land-based heat waves. Additionally, the scientific community is closely watching atmospheric water vapor. Warmer air can hold more moisture, and there's now evidence that in some conditions, this extra atmospheric moisture can actually amplify heat waves. Humidity levels in affected regions are being monitored to see whether this factor is contributing to the extreme conditions. Scientists are also tracking the behavior of hurricanes and tropical storms. Warmer oceans and warmer atmospheric conditions can create a more favorable environment for cyclone development. Some models suggest that we might see intensified tropical systems develop in the Atlantic or Mediterranean as a result of the current conditions. Drought conditions are another key focus. The heat waves are not occurring in isolation. They're often occurring in regions that are already experiencing drought. Northern Africa and parts of the Middle East have been dealing with multi-year droughts. Similarly, parts of Southern Europe have experienced reduced rainfall in recent years. The combination of heat and drought is particularly dangerous because it amplifies both the direct effects of heat and the indirect effects through water scarcity. Climate scientists are also watching global carbon dioxide and methane levels. As we've discussed, the primary driver of this warming is the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. If emissions continue at current rates, we'll see further warming, and with it, more frequent and more intense heat waves. Some research suggests that permafrost melting caused by warming in polar regions could release massive amounts of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, which would accelerate warming further. The behavior of ice sheets is also under intense scrutiny. Both the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet are losing mass at accelerating rates. If these sheets continue to melt, it will raise sea levels but also alter global ocean circulation patterns, which in turn affects atmospheric conditions worldwide. Furthermore, scientists are paying close attention to vegetation stress and wildfire risk. The combination of heat and often concurrent dryness creates conditions where vegetation becomes extremely flammable. Massive wildfires don't just cause immediate destruction, they also release enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and other pollutants into the atmosphere, further warming the planet in a vicious cycle. There's also the question of how ecosystems will respond and adapt. Scientists are monitoring whether species distributions are shifting as a result of these heat waves. Some species are moving northward or to higher elevations, seeking cooler temperatures. If this happens on a large scale, it could have cascading effects through ecosystems. Perhaps most importantly, scientists are watching to see what happens to global climate models themselves. These events are being fed into climate models to improve their accuracy and predictive capability. The fact that these simultaneous heat events are occurring somewhat faster and more intensely than models predicted suggests that our climate system may be even more sensitive to warming than previously thought. Behind all the data and all the scientific analysis are real people experiencing real suffering right now. In Cairo, a 65-year-old woman named Layla refused to leave her apartment during the peak heat hours, even though her air conditioning unit was barely functioning. She was terrified of the heat outside. She waited until evening to go to the market for food, queuing alongside hundreds of other people trying to accomplish their daily tasks during the cooler parts of the day. She told a reporter, "We used to have time between dangerous heat and comfortable temperature. Now, there is almost no comfortable time at all." In Athens, a 72-year-old man named Dimitri experienced a heat stroke while waiting to see a doctor for an unrelated condition. He had tried to walk to the hospital during the morning, thinking it would be cooler, but the temperatures were already in the high 30s Celsius. He collapsed and was brought to the hospital by paramedics. His experience is far from unique. Hospitals across southern Europe are reporting that heat stroke cases have increased tenfold compared to previous years. A farmer in central Spain named Carlos watched his irrigation system struggle to keep up with the water needs of his crops. The irrigation canal that had reliably supplied water to his land for decades was running dry earlier than ever before. He began to do the math. At this rate, within a few years, he wouldn't be able to grow the crops that his family had farmed for 4 generations. He wasn't alone in this realization. Across southern Europe, farmers were making the difficult decision to abandon crops or invest in expensive alternative water sources like desalination. Construction workers across both affected regions have effectively stopped working during peak heat hours. Many construction sites have instituted new policies where no outdoor work is permitted between 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. This means construction projects that were already behind schedule are falling further behind. The economic cost is mounting. Mothers in affected regions are struggling with how to keep their children safe. Public swimming pools have become dangerously crowded as families seek places to cool off. But with so many people packed into these spaces, it's becoming difficult to maintain safety and sanitation standards. Playing outdoors, something that had been normal for children for generations, is now considered dangerous during large parts of the day. The elderly population is particularly vulnerable. Living alone on fixed incomes, many simply cannot afford to run air conditioning continuously. Some have been choosing between paying for cooling and paying for food and medicine. Stories are emerging of elderly people checking into hospitals just to get into air-conditioned buildings, even though they're not seriously ill. In some cases, people are relocating temporarily. Families who can afford it are fleeing to cooler regions or higher altitudes. This creates a secondary economic problem, as it strains resources in destination areas and disrupts normal business and services in origin areas. The psychological impact is also significant. Heat, anxiety, and climate grief are real psychological phenomena that mental health professionals are increasingly treating. People are experiencing depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress-like symptoms related to extreme weather events. The question everyone is asking is, what's going to happen next? When will this heat wave end? What does this mean for the future? Let's start with the immediate outlook. Based on current weather models, the heat is expected to persist for at least another 1 to 2 weeks in both affected regions, though the models become less reliable the further out they project. Some forecasters are warning that these heat waves could extend into the fall months, which would be highly unusual. The forecasting community is also watching for signs of the conditions that typically break heat waves: cold fronts that sweep in from the north, or changes in atmospheric patterns that allow cooler air to move into affected regions. So far, these patterns have been remarkably resistant to change, which is part of what makes this situation so concerning. But looking beyond this week or this month, the question that scientists are really grappling with is what this portends for the future. If we continue on our current trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions, how much worse will this get? According to climate models, if global warming continues at its current pace and reaches 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is the target that many nations agreed to in the Paris Climate Agreement, though even that target is starting to look optimistic, we can expect heat waves to be 3 times more frequent than they were in the late 20th century, significantly more intense, longer lasting, and affecting much larger geographic areas. At 3 degrees of warming, these events become even more severe and more common. We're essentially looking at a future where these kinds of simultaneous multi-continental heat events could become an annual occurrence rather than a rare emergency. There's also the question of tipping points. Climate scientists have identified several potential tipping points in the climate system, critical thresholds beyond which changes could become irreversible or accelerating. Some of these tipping points involve the Arctic ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet, the Amazon rainforest, and other critical systems. Some research suggests that we may already be approaching or have crossed some of these thresholds, which could mean that even if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions today, we might still see significant additional warming in the decades to come. This is the scenario that keeps many climate scientists up at night. But what can be done? Are we merely passive observers to this unfolding climate catastrophe? Or are there actions that can mitigate the damage? The good news is that there are solutions. They require coordinated global action, significant investment, and political will, but they're not impossible. First, there's the question of emissions reduction. Transitioning away from fossil fuels is the fundamental requirement for addressing climate change. This means accelerating the deployment of renewable energy, improving energy efficiency, and transforming transportation systems. Many countries and regions are making progress on this front, but it's happening too slowly to prevent additional warming. Second, there's adaptation, helping communities and systems cope with heat waves that will inevitably occur, even if we're successful in limiting future warming. This includes developing and deploying better early warning systems for heat waves, retrofitting buildings to be more heat resistant, creating more green spaces in cities to provide cooling effects through vegetation, improving water management systems, developing heat-resistant crop varieties, establishing cool centers where vulnerable populations can go during heat emergencies, and updating building codes to account for the new climate reality. Third, there's the question of protecting vulnerable populations. Those with the least resources are often those most affected by climate change. Targeted programs to help low-income communities adapt to heat are critical. Fourth, there's public health preparation. Healthcare systems need to be prepared for the surge in heat-related illnesses that will accompany these events. Training healthcare workers, stocking appropriate medications, and planning capacity are all essential. Some regions are taking innovative approaches. Dubai has begun using cloud seeding technology to increase precipitation. Several European cities are creating cool corridors, routes through cities with maximum shade and water features. Some countries are experimenting with reflective road surfaces that absorb less heat. Others are investing heavily in urban forests and green infrastructure. There's also growing interest in geoengineering, large-scale interventions in the climate system itself, such as injecting particles into the upper atmosphere to reflect sunlight. While such approaches might sound like science fiction, they're being seriously discussed by scientists and policymakers as a potential last resort if emissions reduction efforts fail. This week's simultaneous heat records on 2 continents are not anomalies, they're warnings. They're warnings that our climate system is changing faster than many people realize. Warnings that the impacts of climate change are not some distant future problem. They're happening now to real people in places we know and care about. They're also evidence that climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's an economic issue, a public health issue, a national security issue, and a humanitarian crisis all rolled into one. The synchronicity of these events is particularly instructive. When North Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Europe are all experiencing dangerous heat simultaneously, it demonstrates that climate change is not a regional problem that some areas might face while others escape. It's a global phenomenon with local manifestations. Scientists emphasize that this is not the worst it will get. Given current rates of greenhouse gas emissions, we can expect even more extreme events in the future. The heat records being set this week will likely be broken within the next few years or decades. But there's also a message of hope embedded in this crisis. We know what needs to be done. The technology exists to transition to clean energy. The knowledge exists to help communities adapt. What's needed is the political will and the global coordination to make it happen. 2 continents are setting heat records in the same week. Scientists are watching. The world should be watching too. Because what's happening in Cairo, Athens, Baghdad, and Barcelona right now is not just a story about weather. It's a story about the kind of planet we're creating through our collective choices about energy, transportation, consumption, and development. The good news is that those choices are not final. We still have time to change course. But the heat records being set this week suggest that time is running out. The question is, will we heed these warnings? Will we treat climate change with the urgency it demands? Will we take the actions necessary to prevent an even more extreme future? The answer to those questions will largely determine what our world looks like for generations to come. For now, as this week's heat waves continue, millions of people are doing their best simply to survive. Scientists are continuing their vital work of monitoring, understanding, and warning us. And the planet continues its inexorable warming. We're watching. We're waiting. And we're hoping that this moment, this week, when heat records fall across 2 continents, becomes the moment when humanity finally decides that enough is enough and commits to the changes necessary to protect our future.